Vietnam exported goods to the US face at least 20% tariffs. Why has Vietnam become a US trade trampoline? Why did zero-tariff benefits turn into an Asian crisis? How should China respond to Vietnam's backstab? Hello everyone, I'm Lao Lu. Over the past decade, I've witnessed ASEAN transform from a supporting actor in Made in China to a critical link in the global supply chain. But a recent event has given me a whiff of danger. On July 2, Trump announced on social media that the US and Vietnam had reached a trade agreement. Vietnam would fully open its market to US goods, while Vietnamese goods exported to the US would face at least 20% tariffs, with re-exported goods facing as much as 40%. This agreement seems like a compromise from Vietnam, but it actually hides a deeper scheme. The zero-tariff benefits between China and ASEAN under the RCEP framework are being turned into a backdoor for American goods to enter ASEAN by Vietnam. What's more alarming is that this model is spreading across Southeast Asia. Indonesia announced near-zero tariffs on 1,700 types of US goods, and Cambodia signed a reciprocal trade framework overnight. If this beggar-thy-neighbor practice is allowed to continue, the entire Asian trade landscape will be completely rewritten. Next, I will analyze this crisis from 3 dimensions. How is Vietnam using RCEP's sugar to hand a knife to the US? How ruthless is America's Trojan Horse strategy? How can the domino effect among Asian countries be broken? How is Vietnam using RCEP's sugar to hand a knife to the US? In the first 4 months of 2025, Vietnam's export data for computers, electronics, and components showed remarkable growth. Export value reached $29.26 billion, a year-on-year increase of 36.2%, with exports to the US reaching an astounding $10.71 billion, a jump of 57.6%. While these seemingly impressive figures outwardly reflect the rapid rise of Vietnam's electronics industry, they conceal a deeper economic logic. Through cross-referencing multiple data sources, the truth gradually emerges. Chinese customs statistics show that in 2024, China's exports to Vietnam reached $59.6 billion, while the U.S. trade deficit with Vietnam in the same period was as high as $50 billion. This data discrepancy reflects a unique phenomenon under the restructuring of global industrial chains. A large number of core components such as semiconductor chips, precision electronic components, and communication modules from China are continuously transported to Vietnam via China-Vietnam cross-border railways and sea routes. In industrial clusters like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, these components are assembled using relatively cheap local labor in Vietnam, ultimately entering the U.S. market under the Made in Vietnam label. This trade model not only reshapes Asian trade flows but also sparks in-depth discussions on global trade rules and industrial policies. Even more exaggerated is the complex game in re-export trade. According to the 2023 report by the U.S. International Trade Commission, the scale of Chinese goods re-exported to the U.S. via Vietnam reached $90 billion last year. If the value-added portion of components assembled in Vietnam is included, the total value of goods involved climbs to $120 billion. This scale is equivalent to 12% of total U.S. imports from China, and its sheer volume directly impacts the U.S.-China trade balance. The U.S. imposing a 40% punitive tariff on these goods is estimated to directly cut China's exports to the U.S. by 34% to 45%, severely hitting China's traditional manufacturing export chain. Conversely, despite having to bear the 20% intermediate tariffs set by the U.S., Vietnam benefits from the zero-tariff advantage granted by the U.S.-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement and a 15% to 20% commission mechanism on re-export trade, forming a unique trade arbitrage model. Ho Chi Minh City customs data shows that Vietnam's re-export trade surplus surged by 170% year-on-year in 2023, with net profits for companies in electronics, textiles, and other sectors generally increasing by 30% to 50%. This seemingly passively pressured but in fact actively profiting situation is reshaping Asia's trade profit distribution pattern. Vietnam's calculation is shrewd. Backed by China, the global manufacturing hub, it builds a production system with nearly local supply chain costs, while selling products to the world's largest consumer market, the US, thereby reaping benefits from both ends. This eating at both ends trade strategy is essentially an implicit overdraw of the trust mechanism of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. Under the RCEP framework, China implements zero tariffs on over 90% of tariff lines for Vietnam, yet Vietnam, through rules of origin loopholes, packages products containing a large number of Chinese components as made in Vietnam for export to the US, circumventing up to 46% of US-China trade tariff barriers. This arbitrage model is triggering a chain reaction. ASEAN countries like the Philippines and Thailand have begun to study similar paths. Cambodia is shifting its textile supply chain to China, and Malaysia is accelerating its docking/connecting with manufacturing capacity in the Guangdong-Hong Kong-Macau Greater Bay Area. Against the backdrop of rising trade protectionism, Southeast Asian countries generally face a dilemma. If they adhere to RCEP principles, they might miss out on U.S. market share. If they follow the Vietnamese model, the process of regional economic integration will face a crisis of trust. What's even more alarming is that the U.S. is using policies like the Inflation Reduction Act to induce Southeast Asian countries to build de-syndicized supply chains. This strategic game may completely reshape the Asian trade ecosystem. 2. How ruthless is America's Trojan Horse strategy? America's goals extend far beyond Vietnam. Looking back at the negotiation process of the 2018 US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, the US, with reshoring manufacturing as its strategic core, demanded that the North American value content of automotive products be at least 60% produced within the three North American countries, coupled with strict labor standards, forcing multinational car companies like Toyota and Hyundai to relocate production lines from Asia back to North America. Now in Vietnam, the U.S. is repeating its trick, using the Reexport Tariff clause in the Vietnam-U.S. Comprehensive Trade Agreement to impose punitive tariffs of up to 40% on third-country re-exported goods. This tariff barrier essentially forces Vietnam to choose one between the U.S. and Chinese supply chains. 68% of components for Vietnam's local electronics manufacturing depend on Chinese imports, and this U.S. move is tantamount to cutting off its industrial lifeline. Even more strategically profound, the U.S. is leveraging Vietnam's status as an ASEAN member to use the RCEP framework's zero-tariff policy to turn Vietnam into a transit hub for goods radiating across Southeast Asia. In 2023, Vietnam's imports of U.S. auto parts surged by 217%, and the trade volume of goods assembled and then re-exported to ASEAN countries increased by 134% year-on-year, forming a new trade chain of U.S. production plus Vietnam re-export plus Southeast Asian consumption, which in effect pries open the markets of RCEP member countries. Take soybeans as an example. The U.S. imposes a 25% tariff on Chinese soybeans, but through re-export via Vietnam, the tariff is almost zero. In 2024, Vietnam's soybean imports from the U.S. increased by 42% year-on-year, with 70% of that ultimately flowing to the Chinese market. This circuitous salvation makes the US-China tariff war almost meaningless. What's more frightening is that the US is trying to replicate this model in strategic sectors like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. Commentary and analysis: America's Trojan Horse strategy is a boiling the frog slowly gradual infiltration. Looking back at history, after the U.S. initiated a trade war against China in 2018, it immediately launched a Section 301 investigation against Vietnam, using a 25% steel and aluminum tariff as leverage to force Vietnam to sign the U.S.-Vietnam Trade Agreement, opening key markets such as automobiles and agricultural products. This process is akin to Britain breaking Japan's isolationist policy in the 19th century through the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of Amity and Commerce, leveraging tariff barriers to pry open market access. Now, the U.S.'s zero-tariff policy towards Vietnam is actually designed to make Vietnam a strategic fulcrum for penetrating the ASEAN market. According to U.S. Department of Commerce data, in 2023, U.S.-Vietnam trade exceeded $136 billion, a year-on-year increase of 17%, with U.S. auto parts, genetically modified soybeans, and other products experiencing exponential growth in exports to ASEAN. This point breakthrough area strategy is deconstructing the core advantage of the regional cumulation rule of origin in the RCEP agreement, when U.S. auto parts assembled in Vietnam can enjoy RCEP zero-tariff treatment, while similar Chinese products face double standards. The trust foundation of the regional industrial chain is being quietly eroded. From a geopolitical perspective, the U.S., through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPF, has signed a digital trade agreement with Vietnam, further strengthening its control over cross-border data flows, forming a dual, constraint/control, of trade plus technology. This divide-and-conquer strategy is more insidious than a direct trade war. Ostensibly promoting free trade, it actually incorporates ASEAN countries into a US-led economic order through rule restructuring. Data from the Thai Ministry of Commerce shows that in 2024, the US has replaced China as Thailand's third-largest agricultural product importer, reflecting a subtle shift in the Southeast Asian market landscape. When ASEAN countries gradually realize that their domestic manufacturing is trapped in low-end locking under the impact of US capital, and China's synergistic effect as the core of the Asian supply chain is systematically weakened, the entire Asian trade system will face a triple crisis. First, increased risk of regional value chain fragmentation. Second, obstruction of RMB internationalization. And third, pressure to restructure multilateral free trade rules. Once this strategic imbalance forms, Asian countries' bargaining power in global trade negotiations will be permanently diluted. 3. How can the domino effect among Asian countries be broken? Vietnam's demonstration effect is already evident. To avoid a 49% tariff, Indonesia announced near-zero tariffs on 1,700 types of U.S. goods, including electronics and machinery, and pledged to purchase U.S. liquefied natural gas. Cambodia, meanwhile, signed the Cambodia-U.S. Reciprocal Trade Agreement, reducing tariffs from 49% to 20%. These seemingly life-saving compromises by these countries are, in fact, paving the way for an Asian NATO for the U.S. Even more alarming is the attitude of the European Union. The free trade agreement between Vietnam and the EU, EVFTA, requires that the origin value content be at least 40% produced in Vietnam, which is exactly consistent with the US strategy. If the EU also joins this supply chain scramble, Asia will fall into a dilemma of being attacked from both east and west. In the face of this crisis, China must employ a combination punch. On one hand, it needs to strengthen its industrial chain ties with ASEAN, for example, by establishing a supply chain security list under the RCEP framework to jointly supervise key raw materials. On the other hand, it must accelerate industrial upgrading, shifting low-end production capacity to its central and western regions, while establishing technological barriers in fields such as semiconductors and new energy. More importantly, it must promote the deep integration of the Belt and Road with RCEP, using infrastructure connectivity to break geopolitical shackles. The outcome of this trade game will determine Asia's development direction for the next decade. As ordinary readers, what we can do is continue to follow developments and spread rational voices on social media, making more people realize that in the era of globalization, any short-sighted beggar-thy-neighbor behavior will ultimately backfire. How do you think China should respond to Vietnam's backstab? Feel free to leave your comments and discuss.